Hi, everybody. Welcome to Graph Power Hour. My name is Paco Nathan, and I am delighted and thrilled to be joined by my friend and colleague, Jessica Talisman. Jessica has been working in this domain of building knowledge graphs, guiding projects working on knowledge graphs, also AI applications downstream from knowledge graphs. Also, the thing that I spotted a year or more ago when we were talking about preparing for some conferences and all. Jessica's insights about how to structure knowledge and how to do a really intentional approach toward developing these kinds of knowledge assets and how to use them in AI applications. Jessica brings a perspective which is very much informed from formalisms in library science, which, in my opinion, are providing a lot of very crucial information, a lot of long-term practice. Let's talk about 3,000 years of libraries developing practices for where we're at right now with AI and some of the problems that we're grappling with. As you know, for instance, the world is recognizing that there's a lot of applications for LLMs. LLMs really like to use content more so than, say, structured data. You need to really blend both. A lot of enterprise data management is based around IT managing the structured data and somebody else managing the content. And now they're realizing, oh no, we have to work together. Um, how does this work out? And I'm actually here in Chicago right now. I've had some fantastic conversations the past couple of days. People very deep in enterprise practices, and a lot of the questions we have, I think, are in many ways answered by what Jessica's been talking about and will be talking about here. So, Jessica, I will turn over to you. Welcome to the show here.
Thank
I'd
you.
love to hear some of your background intro.
Sure. So I am trained as a librarian. I went to school for library science. I also have a master's in teaching, which I think does lend a little bit to my practices. But the formal training was in informatics, which is like the old school way of covering what we're pretty much doing today is managing enterprise data at scale. I recently left Adobe and where I was building large content ecosystems. So it's super relevant. Built an auto tagger, built a graph, and so that we would have a dynamic integrated environment and leveraged heavily SCOS, which is somewhat what we're going to be talking about today is where to start. When you're in an organization that doesn't really have much in the way of semantics, which was the case with Adobe, SCOS is a way to represent language and to reconcile vocabularies across really complex landscapes. And if, one thing that I think resonates with many medium to larger enterprises is acquisitions, for example. Adobe is an assemblage of 40 acquisitions, under one umbrella. And in a lot of these cases where you have acquisitions, there's some autonomy that is held onto or grasped from
Sure.
the acquired company. And you're having to integrate disparate vocabularies and reconcile vocabularies across the landscape to create some sort of unified view. It doesn't mean that it's a unified vocabulary, but how can we reconcile language and vocabularies and concepts across a complex ecosystem and have it make sense for LLMs. The other really important point is that we seem to blast over the fact that these are language models. And so when we are working with language models, language is pretty darn important. And it's something that seems really rudimentary, something really basic. But in my opinion, we don't pay enough attention to language and capturing language in a structured or semi-structured way.
I mean, I'll toss in one thing. I really enjoy using a lot of different elements of the current AI toolkit. LLMs being, of course, very popular, very much in discussion. There's a lot of other aspects, but one of the things that I have found is like, where are the breaking points? Like, where can you push technology and maybe find some of the limitations and trade-offs? And I've seen a fair amount of research. There was interesting research coming out of Bosch late last year, and more recently, Frank van Harmelen and a bunch of others had research. But it's basically pointing to we can show systematically that language models are very good for intended purposes, they tend to fall apart when you're working on semantics across different domains. So if you're
Hmm.
trying to like blend semantics across different domains, this is one place where LLMs actually really tend to fall short. And if you don't have tight semantics and you can't agree with your vendors or your customers or the purchasing department, you're going to get in trouble. So
Yes.
I'm really happy about the kind of guidance. This is just one aspect of guidance, as for instance.
Yeah, very much. And something that we were discussing a little bit before, I'm currently I'm writing a little bit of a tome on metadata schemas. And,
Right.
many of us are caught up in this fever of semantic layers and defining what semantic layers are. We tend to relate semantic layers to the text literal label, maybe some sort of human and machine readable form. And then we have master data management. There's one common denominator that exists at the base of most systems, which is metadata, period. One thing that I am looking at and researching right now, and I'm going to be publishing this as a paper, is that if one common denominator is metadata, looking at it rather than these disjointed processes that have to be governed in these sort of rigid ways, because language is not rigid.
Right.
Um, our infrastructures are dynamic, knowledge is dynamic. So it's changing the way we work from these like sort of antiquated, rigid, more static type systems, and drawing from library science. Library science metadata was never disjointed or uncoupled from a schema. And
Interesting.
starting in the 90s, almost all metadata schemas are available as RDF type vocabularies. So actually in the early 2000s, as RDF started coming on board, but XML before. So the point is that it's about operationalizing metadata and being able to represent it in a fluid, dynamic, disambiguated way, which is where we get to taxonomy and thesaurus, and that's where SCOS comes into play. If SCOS is limited in representing and defining and disambiguating vocabularies because it's not meant to model complexity, but the complexity of a language landscape is enough to have to sort out in those terms. So it's really about defining and reconciling language across the landscape. Bonus points for globalization and localization, because that can be included with SCOS. It's very, very important. But the fact that you can have one single identifier, and I'm going to skip across just to show you what this view looks like, is that you would have one single identifier. We'll take the concept cloud communications. And this is one view from the back end of a thesaurus. I believe it's the complete ISO thesaurus view. And that you are invoking parent-child relations. So you have broader term, narrower term, and you can have related as well. It's a broad relationship. It's not descriptive beyond that. But you're trying to model these structures in such a way that it's super simple for machines to understand and have a map to your language within your organization. Another view, and you can see this here, is alternative medicine. You have your term identifier. It's one single identifier, or URI, that represents a concept. And then you have also alternative. There's no limit in how many alternative terms you can have. Some people identify or know these as aliases. In SCOS, it's an alternative term. And you can include acronyms, synonyms, any sort of view that you want to lend to your vocabulary. And this can be dynamic.
Yeah, and this can also be parameterized. The alternative terms can be parameterized per language or other types of constraints.
Yes. And so it's very, very simple. I wish I had a view of this, but normally if you include the ISO for translation, for language, for localization, you would include the languages you want to include. And at Amazon and Google and larger organizations, you see this done very dynamically. But you'll have ampersand EN, like the normal sort of that captures the translations. Now, there are some issues right now where those translations are sometimes not 100% accurate because language is nuanced, but it still gets you most of the way there.
Okay, excellent. And at the source now, you may be going into this, so stop me if I'm rushing ahead. But You were showing a slide earlier that shows vocabularies,
Mhm.
use of taxonomy, use of thesaurus, use of ontology, and I'm curious. Like, I guess a natural question would be, why do we have to have these different parts? How do they complement each other? What are the differences? How do they fit together?
Yeah. So this is really interesting because most people automatically say, why can't we automate this? Or I'm just going to use Google product taxonomy. You have lots of people trying to like skip this step. And the one of the most important things is with LLMs, you need to profile and characterize your business itself has a persona. You think of it as a fully fleshed out persona. The language that's unique to your business, there's a couple of different factors here. One is open world assumptions, which comes into play, which is, LLMs are trained on the web. And that's its grounding of truth in terms of what things mean and what things are. So there is a need to align domain specific on vocabulary or language and open world. So it's open world and closed world. Mitigating that relationship between those two things, if an organization's definition of architecture is different, or you need to disambiguate it. So for example, if you look up architecture on the web, the majority of material might point to actual physical architecture of buildings, just as an example. But if you're a software company and you just have the word architecture, well, yes, within your domain contextualized, it makes sense that architecture means software architecture or platform architecture. So you want to define and codify these things to help to basically create a digital thumbprint of your business to help to guide LLMs for more accuracy, free from, you're never going to be 100% free from hallucinations. I'll give you an example from within Amazon because I was there early on, and Amazon, it was the seller support services. That's who I worked with. So it was all of our data sort of structured documentation, and it was for anyone selling across on Amazon.com across the world. So it was at the time 98 countries, 31 languages, all of the documentation. You had customer service, you had a learning platform to onboard new sellers to Amazon. Like, you can only imagine the conflict in language that could occur and the nuances of each country. If you're a seller on Amazon in one instance, say in South Africa, it's going to be very different, and the laws are going to be very different than in the United States. So you can imagine how important language and the meaning of things is in that context if you're trying to include chatbots within that ecosystem of seller support services. So Amazon has a homegrown tool that sellers have available to them, and it's called Visa, VISA, all in caps, and it helps calculate VAT, your VAT taxes, which is legal. It's a legal thing in some countries, not all countries, that you need to be able to process and pay or remit your VAT payments. So there was no disambiguation, and so we had a suite of and it was really cool where we had every available language model in it. We could just play with it just to see what the responses would be, and adjust the temperatures and everything within these models. And Visa, of course, an LLM is going to automatically say, well, it's a payment card and process, right? There was no way to disambiguate because to an LLM, Visa is a credit card company. It's a payment, right? It's not a VAT calculation tool.
Right.
So you having to negotiate and mitigate those types of hallucinations that could occur that would lead a customer to arrive at the incorrect answer when asking about the VAT tool, Visa, can have really high stakes and can really ruin a customer experience, because ultimately we should be designing for our customers and helping them make sense of our landscape. It shouldn't be up to our customers to do so. So it really is sort of a duty and responsibility. Aside from internal reasons, we're looking at I think something that library science brings to this practice is that it's all really a service-oriented approach. You're trying to make it accessible and interoperable and retrievable. The FAIR principles are woven into the design and architectures of these systems, because ultimately it's about findability for machines or people.
So maybe a way to characterize it, my impression is like library science, the profession, it's not about offering here's our product, take it or leave it. It's more of that, no, we've got an interaction, we're engaging with you. You have something that needs to be resolved. We're going to work through this together.
Right. And that findability and that reconciliation of concepts across an ecosystem, language is our primary interface as humans. And so it also includes a human in the loop. Many of us think, oh, I'll just build this controlled vocabulary, just a list of words. It turns into just a bag of words that's unreconciled, very ambiguous, no definitions, tons of acronyms. And duplicates. And so when we have these rigid sort of systems that haven't been cared for or cleaned, and we just expect a language model to take care of it from there, we're basically building on top of sand.
Right.
And that's one of the biggest issues that, again, like these are language models. Why are we not modeling language? I mean, it seems like the most fundamental practice and thing to care for. And so the other part of it is I personally, this is an opinion, I think that we struggle with this because it's very hard to fit these workflows of building ontologies that and specifically like these sort of thesaurus type environments. They don't necessarily fit neatly in agile workflows. They fit more of a design thinking. They're iterative. It's going to be constant, like it's constant care and feeding because you want your system to be dynamic. Now, once you have your base SCOS structure, yes, you can automate. There's beautiful ways to automate category assignment and reconciliation across an ecosystem. But it's really about that fundamental base layer that you have the strong semantics woven throughout your system, not just text literal labels, but an actual concept type reconciliation service.
Interesting. So, a question that comes to mind, I do hear a lot about people wanting to automate developing as much as possible, like just throw your unstructured data at an LLM, generate a graph, it's done and done. But, on the other hand, talking about developing assets like a thesaurus and leveraging approaches more like design thinking and more of working across a group, a collaborative approach to it, that seems to be counterpoint to let's just maintain it in our GitHub repo and we'll push a PR if we want to change something and not really care about what the outcomes are, because there could be a lot of serious outcomes just by making a small change in the thesaurus. I can imagine. Is that fair?
Yes, there can be some serious outcomes, but what's interesting, so I came from an environment most recently where everything was just flat lists or buckets and YAML files. Okay. An example. It's really difficult with those flat, undefined, ambiguous terms, where you don't have, you can have definitions, but it creates like YAML's great. But it doesn't have enough rich context and structure in terms of being able to represent in a truly semantic way the definition. So when we look at the structure of a thesaurus concept, we're encoding it in RDF. It could be XML RDF, it could be JSON, it could be a number of different file formats, but it's super interoperable. And just the fact that you're managing from this one GUID, and the most basic, explain it to me like I'm 5 explanation that I have is like the concept that has the preferred label is wearing basically a backpack. And the backpack in it has your alternative labels. If it's misspellings or things that are non-display, but you still want reconciliation, you can use the schema element called hidden labels. So the preferred label is like the label, and then the alternative labels are in the backpack, and that helps with retrieval and reconciliation where it's the same as. And then as we go further, you also have definitions, you have scope notes, you can have related, you can have your definitions can also be encoded as linked data. So you can use HTTP identifiers to ontology rich Wikidata pages.
Yeah.
And that is super powerful and under leveraged. That's a great way to support concept discovery and reconciliation because the machine can infer, can grasp the definition and meaning of a Wikidata page and be able to quickly define something like software architecture. And that type of concept reconciliation, discovery, and definition actually is very streamlined if you think about it versus the YAML or GitHub management where you just have a list, right? Because all of a sudden you have a group of, I don't know, 40 terms that are encapsulated by this one identifier that reconciles those 40 terms with the preferred label and a definition. It's going to be a lot more meaningful for an LLM and humans.
I can imagine that some of these features, like for instance, talking about scope, in a way, they're really tracking the decisions that have been made by the people who are curating. So it's a way of really capturing that information over time.
Yes, and language is very political. That's the other thing is, a lot of times within organizations, we get into these sort of gridlocks because the person who's deciding what the language is going to be, there's going to be other people that obviously oppose your decisions, and it's not like a neutral process. And so having a way to capture all language, that's one of the benefits of SCOS is it's like, okay, cool. Marketing, you have this term. We're going to make that an alternative label, for example. The language is captured holistically.
So an interesting thing, I mean, just to kind of like a concrete example, if you're in a company, words like consideration or disclosure might seem fairly trivial. We all kind of know what those mean, and marketing will be using them all the time. Legal, on the other hand, if you are parsing contracts from your vendors and you run across the word consideration, it means a very, very, very specific thing in contract law. And if you do not follow that, you get in big trouble. So this is where just even in the same company, two executives could be talking about entirely different things using the same words.
True story. I'm going to give another example is for lack of language within a system, true story that this happened, is they had no way to capture the granularity. That's another issue is like with a hierarchy, just thesaurus include hierarchies, which just gives you a basic parent-child type, broader, narrower type relationships. That's important for context. It helps to create a context-rich environment because you're reading the structure, but you're also contextualizing the word. So the contract side of the business and finance, a little bit of a conflict, and it implemented LLMs a little bit too early in terms of trying to gauge contracts and the nature of whether an account was still valid or engaged in with a product or not. And so client A decides, oh, I'm not going to re-up my contract, but I have 2 years left on my license, on my product license, and I have 400 seats. Well, the LLM, because all that was structured was the fact that they decided not to re-up their licenses or their contract. So all users lost access to the product, even though they had 2 years left on their license. So like those types of nuances matter when you're trying to streamline and automate workflows. Is that kind of language reconciliation and that kind of logic has to come into play. That by way of definition, if this, then that, you can actually model that with SCOS and then extend it from there to have more context and meaning and more logic. So that's the other important thing is once you have a SCOS model that models the language, as a thesaurus, you can use SCOS XL, which extends the model, gives OWL, which is like a more mature type. It's a web ontology language. So it's a way to represent the ontologies or the logic, the ontological logic. And then you can build off of that primary model. And it's much easier to build a more mature logical model because you've already reconciled what things are. That's what's critical. Like if we don't define things, if we, if we don't have clear definitions and understanding of our landscapes, then how are you going to apply logic to it? That's the other part of it.
I was at a meetup last night, which was really fun. A friend of mine was presenting, and there were questions being in a RAG system. There were questions about like financial information about Apple, looking through a lot of documents. And the model kept jumping back to, okay, what is in a similar, like what's close in the latent space, bringing up chunks that were relevant to NVIDIA, Microsoft, other companies that were kind of in the same genre as the question was asking about Apple. And then at the end of it, you're like, okay, let's blend this all together. And this is where you can really get in trouble. But yet, on the other hand, if you were doing GraphRag and you were doing semantic expansions within GraphRag and leveraging SCOS, you could be wiping out the stuff that really should not be in there. So this is a more sophisticated approach to preventing hallucination, and I think
Yeah.
one thing that we'll be heading more and more toward.
Yeah, and it's, I think that it's daunting, right? I mean, it's daunting. And one thing that's coming about, and I mentioned this in my 3-part article about SCOS, is that it's becoming more and more clear. Like the generative AI approach is simply that, generative. It's statistical. And symbolic AI is starting to come into the purview. And SCOS is a form of symbolic AI.
Right.
So,
yeah.
right. And so inferencing is very powerful here. And so if you have your primary base model, which is your framework, then there are a million different ways. Like you can have this be the foundation, for example, for your vector, if you have a vector database, so that you can use that to, a SCOS model in order to reconcile concepts across a complex ecosystem. Rather, right?
Filtering and ranking part, especially, yeah.
Exactly. And so you can see here, this is another view, and I think this is the Google Custom Synonym Standard view of a thesaurus. So there's many backend views that you can see that are super, super basic, but you can even represent, for example, here where it's turntables, it's record players. And so you have all your synonyms, and then you have your narrower term and you have your broader terms, but you can see headphones and headsets, like you can even have emojis. There's a number of things that you can encode within the structure it's going to help pick up on these things, but also be able to, because they're so well defined, you can take newly found categories and use this as a base structure to map to. And that's super powerful, rather than trusting blindly an LLM to create those categories for you.
Wonderful. There's a lot of other examples I'd love to go into and dive into more, but what I've noticed is actually we have Q&A already. We have like 8 questions. So I was wondering if we could cut over to some of the questions first off, and I can read this out. I should say this never happens. Usually we don't get questions till like the very end. So great. Thank you, Kaylee.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a great question. So SCOS is an RDF model. And what's interesting is that SCOS is an OWL full ontology by definition by the W3C. So OWL, I'm noticing a lot of confusion in the ether about OWL is not an ontology. It's a web language. So it's a way to represent ontologies or ontological logic. And so SCOS actually is an RDF, very lightweight, and it really depends on who you talk to. Most people say it's a data model, it's a framework, it's not an ontology, but it's available. And in W3C says it's an OWL ontology. So I don't know who we can argue with there, but it is in fact an ontological model, different than OWL, which is a way to represent. So you can actually render a SCOS ontology as an OWL model. So SCOS gives labels to OWL. That's the most important thing. So SCOS XL extension for SCOS makes it so that it plays nicely and can translate into OWL. Once you have an OWL model, there's some work to do in order to transform those individual concepts into actual classes and such. So there's a little bit of integration that has to happen when you do bring those two models or types together in order to make them play nicely.
And to put into maybe software programming terms, OWL would be similar to like a class hierarchy in object-oriented programming. It may be fair to say. And then if you want to think about how you're annotating your code, SCOS is going to describe like what kind of annotations are possible in these different classes.
Yes, but they do render, when you bring OWL into the picture, you don't need OWL to have ontologies. That's the other thing to remember, right?
Right. Yeah.
So it's important. I think it's important, but it is the logic is complex. And again, it's not an ontology. So it's an ontology language. So that's what's important. It's a logical model. So you could take any ontology, not any, but many ontologies, and you can encode that and have OWL as part of that ecosystem, but it's not required.
Right. Okay. And
Yeah.
and it becomes important to consider because if you are in a company that's doing mergers and acquisitions and you have different ontologies and now you have to blend them together because your product SKUs are all jumbled, this can be a real nightmare. But SCOS is a way to get out of the weeds a lot quicker, as I've seen.
Yes. And if we just leave it, let's not overly embellish what SCOS is there to do. Again, SCOS
Yeah.
is there simply to say, hey, these are think of what it lends to OWLs, just says, here are the labels for these things with definitions.
Okay.
So when you have a SCOS relationship, the way that, SCOS XL, you would have preferred label, it kind of promotes it to be this OWL type label. But then also what's interesting, it's same as, you see that leverage. So there's there's some extra noise going on right now because of shackle coming into the picture. So of course there's drama like in any other
Any standards, yeah, any standards account there's drama.
Yeah, of course. But I mean, SCOS is it's a good place to start. So when we leap straight into OWL and we start applying OWL logic and encoding our structures with OWL right out of the gate, and your language isn't reconciled and defined, you're probably going to be building yourself a rat's nest.
Yeah. And unfortunately, a lot of people who go through formal training in developing semantics, knowledge graphs, I won't pick on anybody, but there is a particular tool that everybody knows about for working with OWL, and they sort of jump to that first, and just leave problems later.
Yeah.
How about, okay, Alan had a problem here. Yeah, great. Oh, sorry. There we go. Yeah.
That's what it is it's a concept. It's a concept. Everything's defined as concepts. That's the whole nature of SCOS, is that you're defining concepts.
Yeah. Yeah,
Interesting.
it's a really strange, and unless they were trying to maybe make the point that um, you're not coming up with instances of concepts um, as opposed to labels. I don't know. If these are people who again were more focused on using OWL, I'm trying to understand what their argument was.
Yeah, I mean, like when I look at these, you have to realize that every library system through WorldCat, which is run by OCLC, it's the largest online knowledge base and catalog in the world, and it interconnects every single library and institution across the world and includes every national library. That base model is SCOS. Wikidata and Wikipedia, SCOS. DBpedia, SCOS. So like if we're going to argue about that's one thing, that's what SCOS is. That's what defines SCOS. It's modeling and defining concepts, but that's what it does.
Good to clear that up. Okay, here's another question from Adam. Medical world, UMLS is thesaurus, NOMED CT is taxonomy. Any thoughts on this?
Oh yeah. So SNOMED, it's interesting because actually when I was in graduate school, that's my informatics. It was medical. It was biomedical was my focus. Consumer health informatics. So something that's interesting. Healthline, which is a common resource, that is the consumer health version of NIH's PubMed. That's what SNOMED kind of helps support. Not all. Not saying all.
Okay,
but there's a translation that has to happen from the super academic, heady, National Library of Medicine, which is NIH's huge library, which, that's SCOS. And it is actually a thesaurus type model because that's how, even though, is a taxonomy or really an ontology, it's really more of a thesaurus model because that's how it negotiates between the PubMed academic scholarly publication science-y thing that lives in the National Library of Medicine. And then you get the consumer health version. So it has to have that translation layer to be able to create those healthline pages that speak to the common people in language that they can understand.
Interesting. And If people aren't aware or familiar with PubMed, it's an incredible resource. During the pandemic, there were, and even before the pandemic, I mean, there's a lot of usage in pharma, for instance, in doing drug retargeting and understanding, basically building out graphs to understand pharma. We'll call it a golden triangle. But the idea is like, where are the interactions between genomics and pharmaceuticals, compounds, or possibly toxins, and also then diseases, expressions out of the genomics. And so, there's this public repository of research around the world. A lot of efforts have gone into data mining all those, building up graphs, and then building AI applications based off those graphs to infer. And so this is one example of where we see taxonomies and thesaurus coming into play for super important use cases.
And actually, I was just grabbing a link, is the bio portal is where you'll find like a huge library of ontologies, SNOMED included. So all of those ontologies that roll up or versions of like the lenses, depending on the subdomain within medical systems and genomics, is you can go to bio portal. And I will grab that link because it's pretty fun to go through and sort of cruise through all of those ontologies. It's pretty amazing. And you can actually download and export, and you'll see that SCOS is a big part of the foundation. It's not the only thing. Don't get me wrong. It's not a one and done. This is simply, again, the foundational layer and then adding complexity on top of it when you're ready. So.
Okay.
Good question.
Great.
So this is something that I'm reading about right now, is in the 1990s, when the internet started becoming more commonplace, sort of more widely available, big data happened to coincide with that. But at the same time, library science was working on these metadata schemas that were more holistic. So that means that the schema or ontology was not disjointed from, it was woven into the metadata, which gave way to something called metadata application profiles, which is pretty standard within the library domain. So in analytics and BI, we have MDM, master data management, and semantic layers. They're kind of like these two halves of a whole, and we try to coordinate. Well, in library land, they're inseparable. The two, right? So you never launch a metadata schema without some sort of ontological backbone, because it should be machine readable and human readable. And metadata application profile introduces things like it not only has definitions, usage keys, requirement keys for metadata, but usually those models are also available in SCOS. For reference, I'm going to give another one. An example of this would be Dublin Core, which is one of the earliest metadata schemas and metadata application profiles that speaks to this, that again is available in SCOS. So semantics is very much a part, or can be, I should say, a part of metadata if we choose to make it part of metadata. Meaning
From the library practices, I'm curious, are there formalisms for saying, how do we decide when to update something? Like some definition is drifting, we need to change. Are there, because this is something that people, as they're trying to reconcile, like you say, MDM and semantic layer, they're really struggling over, okay, like who pushes the button? Who's actually driving this?
Right.
But in library land, how's that handled?
In library land, it's just one holistic model. So metadata application profiles, here's an instance. You might have a newcomer into the environment, a new domain, and they have certain aspects that they need represented or somehow refined. So in library land, we do this most often through crosswalks.
Good.
Requirement to crosswalk if there's a new domain or a new need to represent, you first want to take two disparate, so say that you have two metadata schemas or two different renditions of, and you would crosswalk. I mean, it could be something as simple as one, and this is so silly, but it happens. Every single environment I've been in is in a metadata schema, someone might call it title. In another metadata schema, it's called name.
Okay, sure.
Right? I mean, that's so basic. Imagine the issues that arise from those two different representations of the same thing. So reconciling by doing, and these metadata application profiles serve as MDM, but there's an ontological backbone. So what happens is you introduce that ontology logic to even something as simple as SCOS, which is really a concept model. When you introduce that into the ecosystem, you're adding a certain rigor, you're adding logical reasoning by way of broader than, narrower than, and defining these concepts. For example, a preferred label, once you anoint a preferred label once with that identifier, it can't exist elsewhere on another level as a preferred label, not exist elsewhere as an alternative label for another concept. So you're adding like major constraints within that ecosystem
of uniqueness.
It's all about uniqueness and definitions. And that's really, when we break it down, that's what ontologies are about. It is about definitions, defining things. Categorizing and defining things is sort of your first step out of the gate. Now there's more complexity when you add the logic, direct and indirect relations, and you start to represent the complexity and nuances of a space. But I would say that's sort of leaping into the future if you don't have your primary model figured out. You want to be and like wanting to break out of your cage at some point. Just like, okay, I can't model any further. I need to be able to create more dynamic relations in here and just descriptions.
You mentioned a term, and I'd love to embellish more if you could, please. Crosswalks. I'd never heard of this, and then I was working with a federal agency, NOAA, which has a really amazing library practice, probably one of the most sophisticated library practices I've ever seen. And it's used a lot in commerce. Like businesses are going to this all the time. Anyway, long story short, they are managing data. Some of those data sets are like over 200 years old. And you need to understand that, I mean, there's going to be a treaty negotiated for fishing rights. The fishing rights are decided based off of readings from sensors. The sensors are deployed at sea, and they get changed every 10 years because there's some failure, and then the readings are off. And you need to actually be able to align across. And believe me, there are multi-billion-dollar lawsuits that go on if people start arguing about how to interpret that. So what is a crosswalk, and kind of, is this something that comes out of library science?
Oh yeah, so crosswalks are very common practice going back even before digital ecosystems came on the scene. You see it. There's something I came across in my research that was wild. It's called the Mundanium. Have you heard of that?
No.
It's first examples of these sort of dynamic crosswalked organizational things out of Belgium. And you can actually look it up. But it's like the way that, you can think of crosswalks as, for example, if, I'm representing something in Dublin core, what is the translation into these other schemas and other languages? And what I mean by languages is ways of representing. So if I represent something in Dublin core, or I represent something in like paco.com, and it's represented in a certain way, it's just mapping equivalencies that if you call it this, it's this in this other scheme. So the goal of a crosswalk is to help allow different entities and organizations and domains to maintain their uniqueness in the way that they describe and express things.
Okay.
And it just creates an equivalency model, a translation from domain to domain.
Across domains, right? Okay.
Yeah. So, for example, if I use SCOS concept in Dublin core, it's called blah. Title. If it's title, and if my concept is defined as title, preferred label, it's going to be title in Dublin core. So you're just basically helping to map that, but it also allows you then to integrate other ontologies, because the thing about ontology is you use what is useful to you. You don't have to use the entirety of any ontology.
Right. Okay.
Right. So I might want to use friend of a friend to help to represent the social aspects, the social media aspects of my domain, for example. And for Noah, that might be represented necessary for Twitter,
Right.
right? Because you want to be able to surface real-time accurate information that, historical rainfall in a certain, part of the world. And to socialize that, you need to represent it or have it threaded through. So that's really critical.
Let me bounce something off you. Okay, we're talking about language models. As you mentioned before, let's talk about language and working with language. And when you're discussing about the usage of crosswalks, translating, allowing people across domains to communicate with each other, in a way, it sounds to me like an analogy for like integration tools. Like, how do you go from one API to another? And we know about software, how to do integration. It's a big problem. But now we're working with language tools. It seems like we need some integration tools there.
Yes. And so that's where actually metadata schemas, if we think, and I am returning to the metadata schema concept, is often like a tool I love. And there was actually a great article from Netflix, which was the model once represent everywhere unified data architecture, which was fabulous because it's a similar architecture to what we built when I was at Pluralsight, which was basically leveraging Apache Avro and SCOS in order to reconcile vocabulary across a really complex landscape. So having schema registry and validation, which is something that Apache Avro is able to support, you can map that schema, which is your organizational schema that relates to your Postgres or your SQL environment. You can have a validated registered schema that becomes the backbone of your internal workings that then crosswalks to your SCOS, for example, so that you can have, and you can then have transformers that you can, very simple ones that follow the crosswalk logic that's able to mitigate that sort of divide between your Postgres or SQL environments.
Right.
And
so data migrations, which are notoriously difficult. Yeah.
It's notoriously difficult. Now, the cool thing is you're seeing things like tools like Top Quadrant and GraphWise, and a lot of these sort of ontological graph type tools surface things like GraphQL endpoints where you can save your queries as RESTful APIs, even Cypher. Well, you're having a lot of these translation layers made available in a lot of these middleware tools. And it's not so much that I'm saying go and sign up for this $500,000 a year license. I'm more advocating for, if you look at the stack and what those tools are offering, that's a really good way to understand not only the integration problems, but the integration solutions. You can save Sparkle and Shackle queries, for example, as RESTful APIs.
Right.
When you get to that kind of dynamicism within an environment where you're, I see that as the biggest problem to solve right now that's really not been seized. Like there's a huge amount of opportunity in just working on that one thing of how do we provide these translation models, these robust translation models that can work dynamically across an ecosystem to mitigate the differences in machine readability and interoperability.
And I mean, I think it's a positive signal. I've been on a number of projects recently where they're really putting forward, let's leverage some of the RDF tooling, like SCOS, also Shackle, etc., for data integration. Like you might have one data set, let's really model it and understand and validate it as it's coming through, as updates are coming through, and do that for the other 12 data sets that we have to then put together. I work in entity resolution. That's more of the putting it together, but you kind of want to make sure that it's valid first.
Yes. And so like the one thing about ontological models, no matter, is that they have to validate. You don't want to introduce recursive loops or relationship classes because it's just, you're actually, And so there's actually, the reason why these sort of integrations can be majorly complex is you have two different orientations for your validation when you have two different model types, right? So if you have like a SQL schema or Postgres schema, The one thing that I really like about leveraging something as simple as Avro is you can include in that schema validation your requirement keys and usage keys. So here's a very base problem. Uniform identifiers. It's very, very basic. A lot of systems, is it required? It should be. What's the format? Is it 32 character? I hope so.
Right. No,
Like you'll have
they're
things
making it up. Yeah.
where it's like everything you can imagine, a 12 character, 13 character, 32 character, like there's no conformance. That's where crosswalks come in.
Okay.
Is an identifier, for example. But the requirement and usage keys from sort of an enterprise perspective says this field is required. And this is part of what's part of the metadata schema design, which is our base common denominator across enterprises, is you'll have titles required, at least one title, no more than one. It's just one to one. Is it one to many? Is it required field? Is it allowed to be empty? Like that is the most fundamental problem in enterprises is making sure that there is metadata, right? That everyone has a responsibility to populate some sort of meaning within a record, for example, and that we have some semblance of not so much conformance, but then we know how to handle the resolution part and the validation parts, because there's no way to validate if we don't have that base truth.
Excellent. There's a question that's come up. I think you'll like this question. It's too long to put on the screen, so I'm going to have to read it off. But from Sarah, and Sarah can also, if you can jump in if I'm not getting this right, and I'll see. Okay, so I'll read that here. I work in product design, systems for a large organization. Leadership wants it to be AI first, like always, and build AI-powered design tools and a RAG system that might eventually dynamically generate code for UIs, etc. So far, it's been challenging getting accurate or useful results from an LLM because the different design systems in our org, they use different names for the same component. The documentation and guidelines are poor. The relationships between different systems, that's not clear, structured. I have a hunch the ontology pipeline would be so helpful, but what I think I'm back. Oh, sorry, I had a little blip here. Sarah was asking, I have a hunch that the ontology pipeline would be helpful. When I think of where to start, I get overwhelmed. Is there a way to start small or approach that you would recommend? And also validation. Am I crazy? Thank you very much.
Oh God, you're not crazy. Reconcile. I've been there and it's really hard. So the first is controlled vocabularies. I'll give you an example. I've been there. I was recently there, Sarah, so I get it. There's that dream we lean into automating, and a lot of it, unfortunately, I'm going to say it, is that 80% of leadership really doesn't understand. They don't understand language models and how they actually work. And if you distill it to the fact that it's about language, then it starts to make sense. But it's reconciling. So always, I position this as pilots, not, it's easier to leverage the pilot rather than a POC, because POCs are getting a very bad rap, and creating these partnerships. So your vocabulary, and what an adjacent team might call a vocabulary, is first of all a collection of vocabularies. And crosswalks can come into play here, where you can map equivalencies across an ecosystem. So what is one thing, one truth in one controlled vocabulary might map to another truth in another vocabulary. Having those equivalencies is most important. And once you have those equivalencies, there's ways to make this easier. For example, you can use a free tool like OpenRefine to reconcile vocabulary. I wish we had time for that today. But and then you look at, are there metadata standards? So you're kind of surfacing languages down here, and metadata standards is sort of the governing body of that. The metadata standards is the database schemas, like what do we call things in our databases? Now, something I see very, very commonly and within organizations is the sort of infighting and thinking that the journey begins, for example, on a web page in the UI, like that's the rendering. Documentation can be poor. You see organizations that are, basically dictating that in documentation, paragraphs can be no more than 400 words, because that's what's required by chunking, these crazy rules that come up, LLM.text to improve search. Like, we have all of these things that we're doing to circumvent and to avoid the elephant in the room, which is defining the vocabularies, because it is contentious. So starting with controlled vocabularies, it seems laborious, then looking at metadata standards, and then structuring that in parent-child relationships. That's sort of the beginning of the journey. I wish I could say that you could make it easier or shortcut these processes, but starting an initiative like this, where you just have agreements and partnerships, you start to develop relationships. What you're really doing is you're creating a rich knowledge infrastructure. You're trying to mature the organization from a data-only approach to a knowledge approach. That is the difference. And knowledge requires humans in the loop. And right, because part of knowledge is the exchange of information, of the emergence of ideas and thought. And so we're really trying to be able to negotiate these and have these difficult conversations. And controlled vocabularies to metadata standards, structuring it as a taxonomy. It's not super sophisticated. Even, within a product landscape, it's something that I think that product managers can easily own and drive. Has to be managed, though, as a program. That's my one thing, is because programs are sustained efforts that weave throughout many products. And as Sarah mentioned, is that product A, product B, you have product managers managing different products. The issue is language. And so that the segues are across multiple products, which makes it a program. So that's the other thing. I think that Amazon's onto something, in that when I worked there, I was a program manager.
Okay.
And because I was building a program that worked across multiple products. And that's the other part of this type of effort.
Yeah, interesting. And I mean, when people think of language as being something static and you can just build a model and you're done, I mean, taking this from the view of a program manager coordinating across different products, every time there's a new product launched, every time there's a new feature to a product launch, every time there's an update, you are effectively changing the language and the definitions. And I mean, your customers kind of care about this.
They do care. And what's interesting is, like, the other side of it is, because of LLMs, that feature factory, we are becoming those features, we can pump those out really fast.
Yeah.
So, and that means that the characterization, the functions, and that's something that's interesting, the functions of your products changes. But that's something that I left out when we were talking about how we build these systems and how we build like a really dynamic, robust thesaurus type model. Man, it's about functional requirements. That's something that librarians bring into the picture. Everything starts with functional requirements. So you are having to figure out, okay, what if you just ask those simple questions in even sort of interviews across an organization? What are the functional requirements of a robust sort of reconciled language system ontology like SCOS? And you can check the boxes. Like, I need reconciliation between what everyone calls everything, so that we have one way to describe things, but account for all the many things to describe this thing. And that's what's really, really important, is like making room for and capturing everyone's language. So that's what SCOS does, is it doesn't dismiss other language, other ways of describing something. The idea is to reconcile it by accounting for it holistically. And that's what's critical, is that you're not, once people kind of calm down and realize that we're not choosing, there's not one label necessarily there is in the preferred labels, the one to rule them all, but actually that concept incorporates all of the labels for that thing.
We actually have a lot more questions, and they keep coming in. We should talk about doing a second part. I do want to put some of your contact info up, so people, like, for instance, Sarah, contact Jessica. So if there's a slide you have also, let's put that up. And I know there's a lot of other questions. I apologize, we're not going to have time to go into all of these, but let's talk about follow-ups. And I know, Jessica, you'll be on a lot of podcasts coming up, and some very recently, but also some conferences coming up. So if there are ways where people can connect with you and maybe dates that you want to talk about.
Sure. I'm going to be at Semantic Data New York, October 14th, which is a really interesting conference. I tend to do non-vendor type conferences. Connected Data London, of course, which is in November, the 20th and 21st of November, which I went last year. It was just fabulous. It's an amazing conference.
It's
Such
great.
a cool conference. And I'll be at Data Day Texas, January 2026. And I have, I'm doing an O'Reilly event also in November, the data engineering power thing, super
Oh,
event.
fantastic. Oh,
Yes.
fantastic.
Yes.
And definitely subscribe on Substack too. Definitely check out what Jessica's writing. I know you've got other plans for writing. I don't know if I should even delve into that, but I think
Yeah.
we're
Writing a
going to see
book.
it in
Yeah.
serialized, get some previews.
Yeah. And I really value anyone's feedback. Like no feedback is too harsh or, because this writing is sort of foundational to the book that I'm writing, which is called Intentional Arrangement, which positions that, we've been intentionally arranging our information and data ecosystems for centuries and where we are today and how you can build in more detail something like the ontology pipeline. So
I want to shout out, I know Christian, Adam, George, many other people had questions. Again, please reach out to Jessica. I think we should probably talk more about follow-up. I'll put in a plug. I'm at Senzing. When you run entity resolution, whether it's Senzing or any of those, but typically Senzing, when you run any resolution on structured data, you end up effectively with a thesaurus. And this is something you can leverage in your AI applications downstream once you're building a knowledge graph, building out graph RAG, especially building agents, because there's even more reason why you want to get the semantics right. Jessica, I look forward to talking to you very soon, and thank you very much for everything here. And thank you all for your questions, and please reach out more.
thank you.